What's cracking, everybody? Welcome back to Cheap Seats and welcome to the Kraken prospect pool anyway, but welcome to the Kraken organization. 6 new members from this year's 2025 Kraken draft class. They end up making 6 selections in this year's draft, one in an incredibly lengthy first round, and then they make 5 picks on day 2 via a couple of trades to move around in the second and third round, as well as add another pick in the 7th. We can get to those, especially the second round one. The 7th round probably doesn't make too much of a difference, but you never know. But either way, we'll start at the top in the first round. Again, a very lengthy first round, which I streamed the entire thing of. I might not have streamed the entire thing if I knew it was going to be as long as it turned out to be. The stream ended up being 4 hours and 47 minutes, as the first round itself went well over the 4-hour mark, about 4.5 hours of first round drafting, which is kind of funny and kind of very NHL. That part of the reason they went to this decentralized version of the draft for what seems like it's just going to be this 1 year was to try to speed things up. They felt like the first round was taking too long, and maybe part of that was that they were letting pretty much entire front offices and all their friends and family come up on the stage before making a selection. So if you just send them all out to their virtual areas, then they don't have to deal with that problem. The only person that comes up on the stage is the player they end up selecting, and then you can send them off to this awkward little Zoom meeting room where they have some technical difficulties that were, not really on the NHL's fault. Every Zoom meeting has people talking over each other, not really knowing who's going to talk at what time, and yeah, it didn't feel the same. They tried to kind of gaslight it. Well, Gary Bettman kind of tried to gaslight us at the beginning to thinking that it was just like old times, just all those teams were with us virtually rather than physically. Anyway, it was a bit of a mess, but it sounds like they're going back to the fully in-person draft again starting next year. And certainly as far as the whole saving time aspect, it seemed to actually go the other direction. So yeah, it was it sure was something. But anyway, the Kraken, with the 8th overall pick in that first round, which they do end up using, they don't trade out of it to trade down into the first round, or maybe trade it entirely to get an NHL player from a team. The 8th overall pick is a pretty good asset to try to move, but they do end up making that selection. Unfortunately, with there being kind of going in a consensus top 6 players, one of them does end up dropping a little bit as Nashville goes a bit off the board and kind of reaches down out of the top 6 to pick a player. But with the Kraken being 8th, they needed 2 teams to reach down, and the Bruins don't end up doing that, as they do take James Hagens right in front of the Kraken, who was kind of the last of that group of 6. So then at number 8, the Kraken had a couple of options. They could go the route that I think a lot of people expected them to go in the next best defenseman outside of first overall pick Matthew Schaefer in Radi Mirko, which, well, he was a guy that was expected to be available at 8, and sure enough, he was. And with the Kraken having a pretty strong prospect pool, they've drafted very well over the first few years of their existence, but it's specifically more strong on the forward end. It's not particularly deep as far as prospect defensemen, so Mirka made a lot of sense there. Also a bigger player, and something the Kraken like to have on the blue line. But instead, they go, and I think rightfully so, with the best available player, or at least a guy that you can make that argument for in the best available player in forward or center. We'll see what he ends up playing, but currently listed as a center in Jake O'Brien. The recently 18-year-old, having just turned 18 less than 2 weeks before the draft, 6'2", 170-something pounds, depending on where you look, and probably depending on what day you measure him. Still obviously needs to put on a little bit of weight there to fill out his frame, but that's something that is generally true of most draft picks. It certainly was still true of Matty Beniers, Shane Wright, even guys at the top of the draft, even players that are NHL ready. And I don't know if there's really anybody that was strictly NHL ready coming out of this draft. Usually putting on some weight is something that, understandably 18-year-olds are going to have to do before they're really fully NHL size, even in an NHL that, smaller players can make more of a difference and don't necessarily get pushed around a little bit more. Anyway, he's going to have to eat a couple more sandwiches, but for now, still a 6'2" frame, which is bigger than most of the Kraken forward end. He has played pretty well in these last 2 years with the Brantford Bulldogs in the OHL. 2 years ago in the 23-24 season, playing in 61 games with Brantford, where he put up 13 goals, 51 assists for 64 points, so over a point per game, but then taking a pretty substantial step forward, especially in the goal scoring category, where in 66 games of this last season with Brantford, he had 32 goals, well over doubling his previous season, and then also adding some to the assists with 66, an assist per game, for a total of 98 points. 18 penalty minutes as well, you can see there, so it doesn't end up in the box too often. And then in the playoffs, also managed to be a point per game in 11 games where they did play a little bit more than the previous season. He was able to put up 3 goals, 8 assists for 11 points in those 11 games. So as you can probably tell from those numbers, where he's anywhere from twice as many to nearly 4 times as many assists as goals in each of the 2 seasons he played in the OHL. And we'll probably go back there to play another season in the OHL, but he does tend to be more of a playmaker on the offensive end than necessarily a strict goal scorer. But obviously this last season, he figured out how to score a fair number of goals himself. Still, this is a player who had one of the better hockey senses, kind of sixth sense for where his teammates are at any given time. Hockey IQ is often what you'll hear it called, but very much a good passer, creative passer that is able to use some very strong in tight puck handling abilities to keep the puck away from opponents, and then find passing lanes that most other players at his age, maybe even every other player at his age, just aren't able to find to set up his teammates for some good plays, and then also get himself into a spot where maybe a pass back ends up in the net off of his own stick. Either way, this is a very creative and, so far at this point, a very good passing forward that can make plays happen in the offensive end and in transition. Or in the words of the Elite Prospects Draft Guide from this year's draft class, which, if you're not familiar with Elite Prospects, they are, as the name would suggest, a website that spends their entire time focusing on NHL prospects, and obviously then the draft is kind of their big thing of the year. So they had this to say about O'Brien. Displaying close to X-ray vision, O'Brien spots the tiniest seams between skates, under sticks, and above them. He sees through multiple defenders and behind his back, spotting teammates running to the back post and attacking a few steps late. When he can't spot a lane, he creates it, shifting defenders or faking a shot before dropping a puck to a teammate. All of which they also show in video highlight reel format as they break down O'Brien in a video they have specifically about him over on their YouTube channel, where they also even go so far as to say that O'Brien has the potential, the ceiling, to maybe even be the best player in this draft. Now, if I'm being perfectly honest, I think that might be a bit of a reach. Michael Misa and maybe even Matthew Schaefer up at the top of the draft are going to be hard to pass, but it definitely is high praise from a group of people who spent their entire time looking at these highlights and breaking them down, understanding where these prospects are at, that they think there's at least that ceiling that O'Brien could be the best player in the draft, and certainly his hockey IQ could very well by itself be the best in the draft, and maybe that's a little bit less of a reach than saying that he's outright the best player in the draft. Either way, I think that when this pick was made, there were a lot of people that were confused, maybe even bordering on upset that the Kraken didn't go with the next best defenseman in the draft to Schaefer in Reddy Murko with the pick, as many people expected the Kraken to do so, and instead picked another center. There were certainly a lot of memes out there on social media, depending on where you were, as the Kraken have definitely established a habit of picking centers early in the first round, or really whatever they pick in the first round, they tend to go with the center position. Still, though, I have to say, I think that they did the right thing here, and Botterill even said after the fact that at that point in the draft, you really shouldn't be selecting for positional need. You need to be selecting for the best available player. I think that's what the Kraken did here, and I do think that is the correct way to look at what you're using your selection for, especially in the first half of the first round. Now, obviously, with that said, we're still many years away from knowing who the best picks were in this draft. We still have no idea. It's way too early to say who the best pick available in the first ever draft the Kraken were a part of, where they got Matty Beniers. Obviously, Beniers had a good start to his career, slowed down a little bit. We know how that's all gone, but we're still a long ways away from those players even being into their prime and having some idea of where the end of their career trajectory may end up being, and especially in a draft like this year's, where, as I've already said, there may not even be a single NHL ready player right out of the draft. it's far too early to say. We won't even have significant NHL time, more likely than not, from any of these guys at the end of next season. So even by next year, we're still going to basically be in the dark as to which of these players were maybe a steal who was taken early or late. But as far as what we know right now, I think the Kraken did the right thing by picking the best available player, and especially considering, even if we're just talking about organizational need, well, sure, prospect-wise, the Kraken have a lot of forwards that have been progressing pretty well in their way from wherever they were drafted to trying to make it to the NHL. This is a franchise that needs some scoring at the NHL level, and while O'Brien may not be contributing at the NHL level for another couple years, he probably spends at least one more year in the OHL, and then if that goes well enough, maybe he ends up making that step right to the NHL, kind of like what we might end up seeing from Berkeley Catton this year, but more likely than not, probably still 2 years of development before we see O'Brien making at least a significant impact at the NHL level. Which, just to be perfectly clear, even if it had been Mirka or another one of the defensemen that went towards the top of the draft that the Kraken had decided to select at 8th, that still very much would have been true. Mirka himself looking at least 1, probably 2 years of development before making the NHL level. So while, it does help the Kraken prospect pool, it's not like he's going to make a difference at the NHL level for a couple of years. And for the Kraken, if you were worried about, especially after that first selection and taking another center, about the Kraken needing to fill out their defensive prospect pool a little bit more, with it being, admittedly, again, a bit light coming into this draft. For as strong as the Kraken prospect pool is, they don't have a ton of defensemen, or at least defensive depth in the pipeline. Well, they spent pretty much the entire rest of the draft fixing that problem, as this draft definitely shifted from oops all centers to maybe a little bit more of oops all defensemen, as starting with that 6th pick in the second round, 38th overall, the Kraken do go with a defenseman in Blake Fiddler. Which, right out of the gate here with this selection, I do have to take a moment to at least question, if not criticize, the overall asset management of the Kraken from the top on down, the NHL level, all the way down to the prospect pool. I mean, to go from just a few months ago, you get rid of your maestro, and now you go out and get a Fiddler? I mean, come on, that's just a little bit of lack of foresight, I'd have to say. Jokes aside, though, as far as Fiddler is concerned, he is, as I suggested, a defenseman, and actually a right-shot defenseman, which also turned out to be a bit of a theme throughout the rest of the draft for the Kraken. But the 17-year-old, having not quite yet turned 18, he'll turn 18 on the 9th, so he'll have a birthday not too long after Dev Camp. But O'Brien, a pretty big 17-year-old at 6'4", already over 200 pounds, so he's started to fill out that frame a little bit more than certainly a lot of the forwards in this draft class, or most draft classes. But has played the last 2 years in the WHL with the Edmonton Oil Kings, where in 63 games 2 seasons ago, he had just the 5 goals and 10 assists for 15 points, and then just about doubled those numbers this last year in 64 games with the Oil Kings, where he had 10 goals and 23 assists for 33 points. So not a guy that's going to put up a ton of points from the blue line. Certainly this is more of a defensively focused defenseman. Think kind of an Adam Larson type of player. Now, he's not getting picked towards the top of the draft like Adam Larson did, but that style of guy that he'll get his points here and there, but he is certainly much more of a lockdown defenseman, the type of guy that you might pair with more of an offensively minded defenseman and let them balance each other out, or maybe you put him on a shutdown pair and send him out there against whoever the top line is of an opposing team. That's the idea anyway. See how it pans out. Obviously, a second round pick, we're looking at least 2 years of development before he makes the NHL level. According to, again, the Elite Prospects Draft Guide, Fiddler's impact comes through his defensive impact and frequent advantage creation. With explosive backward crossovers, so he gets back quickly on the back check even while skating backwards and not having to fully turn around and turn his back to the play. But with explosive backward crossovers, he wins the race to the middle before pivoting and surfing into the stop, which is kind of a weird way of wording that in my opinion, but either way, I think you get the point there. Always thinking about body position, he skates through the hands, intercepts opponents with his back, and eliminates off-puck threats. On retrievals, he picks up the puck cleanly, waits for pressure to engage, and then places it to a good spot for his teammates to carry it out. So a guy that can start a breakout fairly well, or at least attract a little bit of attention and wait for that to happen, get one opposing player at least towards him before he passes the puck along and gets that breakout going to try and give his teammates at least equal numbers, if not a numbers advantage. Again, a guy that's going to be much more focused on the back check and defensive zone play and then trying to get you out of the defensive end than he is necessarily going to be in the actual transition himself, pinching down in the forward end or creating in the offensive end once there. But a prospect that does help the Kraken shore up that defensive pool, and especially a right shot defenseman who do tend to be a little bit more valuable and harder to find. Or at least if not hard to find, they do tend to be more expensive because there are fewer of them. So if you're trying to fill out the right side defensively through free agency or trades, it can be a little bit more expensive than trying to just draft and develop the right shot defenseman, something we've already seen the Kraken do a little bit of. But again, they definitely shore up that right side defensively in the prospect pool a little bit through this draft. And real quick, a couple of other things that are probably worth mentioning here about Fiddler before we move on. For one, as far as where he was expected to go, projected to go in this draft, or at least where he was generally ranked by all sorts of different prospect rankings coming in from the different experts across all the different large media sites, he was largely expected to go in the first round. Somewhere in the mid to late 20s is kind of where he was generally ranked. So for him to fall to the Kraken at 36th, actually not 38th, they end up moving up to get him, and that's another thing that we'll get to. But could be a guy that maybe turns out to be a bit of a steal for the Kraken here early in the second round. And as I just said, the Kraken must have liked him enough to go out of their way to trade up with the Flyers to move 2 spots up and get him at 36th rather than hoping he fell 2 more spots to 38. They end up, in order to do that, trade their obviously 38th pick, but then also their late second round pick that previously belonged to the Leafs, and they end up getting the Flyers' early third round pick. So they move a few picks down between the late second round to early third round, having not come into the draft with a third round pick, so it's the only pick they would make in the third. But they must have liked something about Fiddler enough that they didn't want to risk him getting taken in the next 2 draft spots, and specifically get him rather than just whoever the next best defenseman was if he did end up getting selected. And then with that third round pick that they got from the Flyers in order to move up and get Fiddler, they end up selecting another defenseman, this time a left shot defenseman in Will Reynolds. Actually, the only left shot defenseman they get in this draft. Reynolds, another 17-year-old yet to turn 18. He'll turn 18 on the 11th of August, is another pretty big body on the blue line at 6'3", just under 200 pounds. He hasn't quite gotten to that second 100-pound, but somewhere between 180, 190 in that range. He has now also played 2 years in the overall CHL, this time in the QMJHL, where he spent most of that time with the Acadie Bathurst Titan. Either way, in 2 seasons with the Titan, he has again not put up a ton of numbers offensively. In 30 games between the Titan and Huskies in the QMJHL 2 years ago, he had just 4 assists in 30 games, and then last year did take a step up in 64 games, so not only playing time but also point production. He had 4 goals, 10 assists for 14 points, so again, not a guy that's really going to contribute much on the offensive end. Another big defenseman, this time on the left side. But the good news there is that he does seem to be pretty good at those defensive parts of the game. As again, the Elite Prospects Draft Guide points out, Reynolds is a straightforward shutdown defenseman who hits hard, blocks shots, and defends the house. He already boasts a few professional level defensive abilities, reading opposing breakouts and timing himself with the play. He pinches on opponents as they receive the puck, nullifies rushes. In the defensive zone, his game is centered around physical play. He battles with opponents, defends the net, and neutralizes them on the wall. So very much a guy that you're looking at for a second, maybe third pair when he does, or hopefully does, eventually make the NHL. Not probably a top pairing guy unless he really excels in those defensive abilities and can be just a straight up shutdown defensive player that, again, you pair with more of your offensively minded defensemen. Again, kind of how you think of the Vince Dunn Adam Larson pairing. He would be more, again, that Adam Larson guy in that type of a setup, or like I just said previously with Fiddler, someone that you pair with another defensive defenseman and you put him out there to shut down an offensive rush from opposing team. Definitely the type of guy that you'd like to have out on a defensive zone faceoff, or penalty kill for that matter. Without a pick in the 4th round, due to having traded that 4th round pick just a few days before the draft to the Wild in order to get Frederick Gaudreau, trade that I didn't end up doing a full video on because I just didn't really have the time with the draft coming up and some other stuff going on just in life in general, but a trade that gets the Kraken, if you weren't already aware of it, if you weren't with me when I talked about it a couple of times during the draft live stream, Frederick Gaudreau is a depth center. The Kraken just getting a little bit more depth at that center role, potentially a sign that they don't see Veleno as a full-time, at least, solution as the 4C. Definitely Gaudreau a little bit more filling that same role of a likely fourth-line center, so we'll see how that pans out. That'll likely be a fight to see who earns that role starting-wise at the start of the season in training camp and preseason. But either way, the Kraken had spent that 4th-round pick to make that trade. Essentially, they get Frederick Gaudreau, a guy that can contribute for the next 3 years. He has a $2.1 million contract for the next 3 seasons, but they get him with that 4th-round pick. Then moving into the 5th round, where the Kraken make their next selection, they do go back to selecting right shot defenseman with the 134th pick. The Kraken get Maxim Agafonov, a Russian, again, 17-year-old. He'll turn 18 just a day before their previous pick. But having spent the last 2 years mostly in the MHL, which is the junior level over in Russia, 2 seasons ago, from the blue line in 36 games, he put up 8 points with a goal and 7 assists. Then last year in 35 games, definitely an increase in points production, 14 points on 6 goals and 8 assists. So again, not going to put up a ton of defensive numbers. The MHL also tends to be a little bit higher scoring, maybe not quite as much as the CHL leagues, but yeah, this is another large at 6'2", about 200 pounds defenseman that the Kraken are just trying to fill out that prospect pool, especially on the right side for their defensemen. And I suppose since I mentioned it before with Fiddler, I'll mention it here as well with Agafonov. He also is a pick that the Kraken end up getting, a guy that was kind of falling in the draft, largely expected to go in the top 100, or at least ranked in the top 100. He ends up falling all the way down to 134, so the Kraken get a guy that could have easily gone in the 4th round. They get him at the start of could have gone early in the 4th round. Heck, he was even rated as high as 49th or 66th. So this is a guy that had some even 2nd round draft grades, but the Kraken will end up getting him with the 5th selection. Another potential steal, a guy that maybe does have a better chance at making the NHL than your typical 5th round pick. But at this point in the draft, you're definitely looking at more of a if they make the NHL rather than when. And that is certainly even more the case when we get to the 7th round, where the Kraken make their last 2 selections of the draft, which they only came into the draft with the 1 7th round selection, but they end up making 2 as they traded their early 7th round pick to move down and get 2 7th round picks from the Columbus Blue Jackets. And with the first of those 2 in kind of the middle part of the 7th round here, with the 205th overall pick, the Kraken go out and get Swede Karl Annborn. And again, sticking with the theme of right shot defenseman, Annborn is another over 6 foot right shot defenseman that the Kraken get here. It does still need a little bit more filling out of the frame, under 200 pounds, around the 180 to 190 mark there, and has spent the last few years in the junior development programs of the Swedish leagues. He did play a little bit in the HL over in Sweden, the next level up, not quite the elite league or anything like, but in 5 games, 1 assist there. But in the Swedish junior league, he did have 24 points in 39 games with 3 goals and 21 assists. Again, at this point, definitely more depth than an if rather than when they make the NHL level, but the Kraken continuing to take more shots at the defensive end and get more working there in case one of these guys just surprises and develops into more than you'd typically expect out of a 7th round pick, where the vast majority of these 7th rounders will never end up playing in the NHL. But considering the Kraken have drafted pretty well and they've seen some good progress from most of the picks that they've made over their 4 years, now this is being the 5th draft of their existence, you never know, maybe we do end up seeing Mr. Annborn in a Kraken jersey at some point. If that is the case, it probably won't happen for quite a few years. And that is obviously still going to be true of their last pick, where they do end up going with another forward, bookending their oops all defenseman draft with a forward at the early part of the 1st round, and then a forward all the way down here in the very late part of the 7th round. This time, another Swede, so they take 2 Swedes here in the 7th round. In forward, Luke or Loke, I'm not know the pronunciation exactly, we'll figure that one out in time, but Loke Krantz, just listed as forward, so potentially could play center or wing. Probably not going to be an NHL center if he does make the NHL level, but again, you never know. Yanni Gourde was undrafted and still was a very productive, and still is a very productive NHL center. But Krantz, again, maybe not someone we expect to see at the NHL level, but has been doing pretty well over in the Swedish junior leagues. Not scoring a ton with 44 games played this last season, just 17 points on 12 goals, so a good amount of goal scoring at least in those 17 points, and then the 5 assists. He is, again, a little bit bigger of a frame, so maybe the Kraken just seeing if they can get a little bit more size into their forward prospect pool at 6'1", and not quite yet 200 pounds. But again, the Kraken going with a little bit more size overall in this draft class. So even if the Kraken didn't necessarily stick with the overall theme of a defenseman here with the last pick, they definitely stick with the overall theme that was even true going to their first pick of O'Brien with size. Definitely a draft class that is pretty big here. All of them over 6 foot, and quite a few on the defensive end. In the end, 3 right shot defensemen, 1 left shot defenseman, a center, and a forward or center, winger, whatever Krantz turns out to be. But the Kraken go out and get definitely bigger in their prospect pool and certainly fill out the right side, but just the blue line in general. After that first overall pick, or first overall, the 8th overall pick, but first pick for the Kraken of Jake O'Brien, the best available player at the time. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier on, but just for anybody that is concerned about the Kraken continuously selecting centers and having too many centers in the pipeline, I wouldn't worry about too many centers in the pipeline. It is not uncommon for a player that's listed at center when they're drafted to end up moving to the wing by the time they get to the NHL. Again, most of these guys that are getting drafted have been the best player at every level that they've, or one of the best players at every level that they've played at, and especially on the forward end, if they're going to be a forward, the best players tend to play at center. So then as they move up, get to the AHL or the NHL level, some of those guys inevitably end up moving out to the wing. Many wingers in the NHL were drafted as centers, and that certainly is likely to be the case with some of these centers the Kraken have in the pipeline. I still kind of think that's probably the eventual end destiny of Berkeley Catton, though we'll see there. Maybe he can be a little bit more free to play his style of game from the center role, but don't worry about the Kraken having too many centers is basically the gist of it. It's not usually too difficult for a player to make the move from center to wing. It's a little bit more tricky to go from playing wing throughout junior to then the center role. So nothing to worry about there. Again, I think the Kraken do the right thing with that 8th overall pick, assuming that they were going to use it, which they do, in just taking the best available player. And I don't disagree with them that Jake O'Brien probably was that at that time. Now, sure, if you watch the live stream, which went on for 4 hours and 47 minutes, I did mention that personally I was kind of hoping they'd take Victor Eklund, but he ends up going a little bit later in the draft to the New York Islanders, who did have a pretty good draft. Either way, certainly as far as offensive upside is concerned, if you're just drafting for upside, the Kraken, I think, got the best available player at that 8th spot. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below, what you thought of this Kraken draft class, what you thought of that first round, if you stuck around for all or most of it. I don't really know why anybody would stick around past the 8th pick, especially considering the draft went on for almost 3 more hours after that point. In fact, I think it went on for, over 3 more hours after the Kraken made their 8th overall selection. Had I known that, I probably would not have streamed the whole thing, but we got through it. I appreciate everybody that did join for that entire stream. A couple of other things, a couple other pieces of Kraken news that we've seen here that isn't quite worth its own video. I mean, maybe there's an argument to be made that I could make a short video about the first one. The biggest one is that we are now pretty much confirmed, Jason Botterill has confirmed that the team is not planning to buy out Philip Grubauer. So Grubauer is going to come into the season as the Kraken backup again. And in a season that with the Olympics is likely to be once again condensed with lots of back-to-backs, they're going to need Grubauer to be better if they want to make the playoffs. Kind of the general feel now with this move is that the Kraken, while they do want to make the push for the playoffs this season, this might be a season where they're more trying to just take a step forward, and then in 2 years they try to make the playoffs. They aren't necessarily all out trying to make that run at all or nothing, make the playoffs this season. They're just trying to slowly position themselves a little bit. And if you don't see yourself realistically as a playoff team going into the year, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to buy out for a better backup if you're not really doing everything you can to make the playoffs. So we'll see how it goes. I suppose the good news there is if the Kraken have a similar season this next year to what they had these last 2 seasons and end up towards the top of the draft, next year's draft is a lot deeper and more talented at the top, so that wouldn't be necessarily the worst thing, I suppose, from that end of things. But yeah, hopefully they can still find a way to be a bit better and more entertaining to watch. I guess they're still entertaining. They're just kind of entertainingly bad. Anyway, let me know what you think down in the comment section below. And until next time, stay safe out there. Be good to each other. God bless, and go Kraken.